Thank you all. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I love an in-person event because it gets us away from the computers and the day job. So it's fantastic. And I've been known Paquita and colleagues, so I feel I'm amongst friends and really delighted to reconnect. Ethics has never been more important than it is now, as we know, not just in health and social care, but in our wider world. We have many areas of concerns and many opportunities to do more good. This topic is of particular interest in sort of three areas. I'm editor of Nursing Ethics. I've been editor for quite a long time. And recently we had a submission that we sent for review. And you probably know an editor sends articles for review, usually to people on the reference list, right? So we sent this article for review. It was quite a contentious topic. So we sent it for review. The reviewers came back, one reviewer said, this is outrageous. This person has plagiarized my work, used my case study and didn't credit it. So I said, okay, so as an editor, you have to deal with this. So we go back to the author and the author said, oh yeah, well, but I used ChatGPT. Yeah. So it was a bit of, it wasn't me, gal, so it was really interesting about not taking responsibility. So the reviewer was in a sense very, very angry and said, you have to do something. So we conferred with Sage, the publisher, and they were really very helpful. And we agreed that rather being, so we, of course, corresponded with the author. And then we agreed with Sage that we would go back to that person's organization, not name them, not name the journal, and say, you need to attend to this in your organization to make sure people are properly educated to appreciate the responsibility around AI. So that was one. And the second area, all of us who work in education, many challenges every day. Do we know this work as a student's work? So I was saying to a colleague, I have a very good colleague at Royal Holloway, and he's in law, and he now gets the students to download an essay from ChatGPT and then to critique it. So that's the assignment, which I think is quite clever. But I've just said, well, maybe they use ChatGPT then to do the critique. So who knows? So and the third area is, which has been of much interest, is I work again with Rob and Anna van der Gaag on a project on fitness to practice and the use of AI. Now, some of you will know that many complaints to the regulators are inappropriate, they don't go anywhere. So we were looking particularly at nursing. We looked at 3 countries. We looked at the NMC, the UK, we looked at one state in America, and we looked at Australia. So we involved the regulators in working with us to see if we could develop an AI tool to sift out those first complaints. About 60% of complaints, at least to some UK regulators, they don't go anywhere, right? So they might be vexatious, they might be inappropriate, they don't belong there. So we thought that if we could have an AI tool, it would spare human resources, because one of the issues is that staff wait a long time, sometimes years, and we thought those resources could be used. So we did the pilot, we collected a lot of data. We haven't reached resolution yet, and I cannot say, is an AI tool better or the same as humans? Humans make mistakes too. So we're now moving to the next stage. So I know very little about how AI works, but I do know a little bit about the practical applications and the maybe optimism, the hope. So this topic is, of course, of great interest. I work in care. I've always worked in care. And this is there is a lot of crisis talk. Some of you might be a bit jaded. It's just crisis, it's endless crisis talk. And I'm head of a Department of Health Sciences. Applications are going down. I'm pleased to say, generally not in medicine, but certainly in nursing, social work, many of the other health and social care professions. Don't have time to talk about the reasons, and I would love to hear from you what the reasons are, some of the reasons. But this question is absolutely critical. Who will care in the future? We have significant demographic changes. We do not have enough human resource. I visited China, I visited Japan, I've been to the States to look at how they use technology. And I have not thus far found, there's no panacea, but we can talk a little bit more about that. So these are very exciting. Some of the potential opportunities. I don't know how you respond to those, having a cup of tea with a robot. The lifting, of course, has seems many benefits because it's not claiming to do the relational piece, which Paquita mentioned. And also this power of these seals, there's various versions of these in cats and so on you can use, particularly in the dementia area. But all of these, of course, raise ethical challenges. And of course, yes, this is the very familiar kinds of news headlines we have. And of course, not just locally. I was on a call yesterday with Howard Catton at the IC and the International Council of Nursing in Geneva. And it's relentless. If you're on Twitter, Howard is there all the time talking about the need for more nurses. And of course, our world is very troubled. You see, we have the Middle East, we have Ukraine, and he talked as well about how international professional organizations can reach professionals in the different countries, and you have to be clearly impartial. So that's a role in terms of supporting staff working in generally very, very challenging circumstances locally and globally. So I love talking to people. I'm terrible. If I invite you to dinner, don't come because I'll probably exploit you. So on Saturday, I have a place in Turkey, and I have two neighbours. So Philip is 91 and Angela is 88. So I said, "Oh, I'm doing this talk this week. What do you think?" So the first quote actually doesn't come from them. It was a Nuffield Council. You might actually have been there, Paquita. It was one of the colleagues in the Nuffield Council, and we were talking about technology. And he said, as you see, I'd rather have a caring robot than a non-caring human, right? Interrogate what do we mean by that shortly. But anyway, so I asked Angela and Philip on Saturday evening. I said, "So what do you think?" So Philip is receiving domiciliary care. They come out to deliver care to him once a day. And his wife, Angela, she said, "Oh, I doubt that a carebot could respond to." She wasn't pointing any fingers or naming any names, but can you imagine the nuance that is required for we as individual humans to respond to other complex, nuanced, possibly irascible, changeable human beings? So I think that's the main challenge in this talk, just to think about that. And then this was lovely because Philip we live in a big house with apartments. So he said, how could a carebot get to me to deliver care? So it would have to get the key from the garage, which is in a little locked box, and then it would have to, go down the main door, and then it has to go down the stairs, and then has to access my flat. So how could that happen? And of course, it made me think of this. And I don't know if you can read it. It says, well, this certainly buggers our plan to conquer the universe. So, how can we get a robot physically down the stairs and so on and so on? So these are some practical issues that our lay public may ask. And the other thing that Paquita mentioned is the haptic and the touch. Mm-hmm. So Philip reached across. He said, the thing is, I wouldn't want to care unless they could have a human touch, the human hand. So I think that's really interesting. And I mentioned this to another colleague, so this is going to get a little bit racy now, excuse me. So I said to another ethicist, and I said, yeah, what about the touch thing? He said, well, maybe we need to look to the sex industry. The sex bots. No, I know nothing about it, okay? Really, I know nothing about it, honestly, truly. But I thought that was interesting, right? So, I think we need to expand our imaginations, maybe, to think about insight. So we've been thinking about technology, looking for solutions into the future for some time. So a few years ago, I did an editorial with two colleagues in Norway. And it's only 1,000 words or whatever. But anyhow, clearly this is the introduction. By 2050, 1.5 billion people will be over 65. That is phenomenal. And when you look at countries like China, as you know, one-child policy, you've got 1 + 2 + 4, one child, two parents, 4. So the need for care, and I don't want to use the word burden, the need for care is phenomenal, and we're becoming increasingly aware of that. So care needs outstrip human resources. The technological solutions, as you know, robots have been around a long time, particularly when you look at production and industry. So, robots is not new, and they've been pretty good at doing dull, dangerous, and dirty work. Care may be dangerous. It's never dull, and it's not dirty work, okay? But nevertheless, that was sort of the background. And then there's all these new developments. So some of you will have come across the robot. You can just do a Google of various kinds of carebots. They're expanding all the time. These are some of the best known: Paro, RoboBear, and Pepper. And the claim for the last one is that Pepper is allegedly capable of understanding human emotions. I'm a skeptic. Really? So, but, you know, maybe it's just a limited imagination. And you can see there's various links here. I'm very happy to share the slides so you can follow some of this up yourselves. So, ethical aspects of carebots, some have been alluded to already. So this issue about deception. If care recipients are unable to judge if the caregiver is a human or a robot, is that an issue? So that's the first one, the problem of deception, which is well rehearsed in the literature. There's an issue about trust. Now, this is critical because who is accountable ultimately? So if a developer manipulates the user and does not act in the user's best interest, there's a huge ethical challenge. You could just imagine, I mean, humans do terrible things, of course they do. There was an issue recently on social media, you probably heard, another kind of technology, it was on WhatsApp, where sadly, it was a nurse who was medicating her care. You could have seen that, you're nodding. So, and then emailing her partner to say, oh yeah, you know, I've subdued this. I mean, absolutely. So we know that humans do terrible things as well. But nevertheless, if developers say, okay, so I want this, you know, the patient in this unit to be subdued and no bother, well, you know, we can just arrange for them to have more sedation, maybe. It's a more dystopian scenario. There are also, the other side of it is people can be over-reliant and over-attached to robots, which is quite an interesting take, if you could imagine what that would be like. And the third thing is informed consent. What do we tell people? How do we tell them? I mean, most of us here, some of you will be experts in AI, but a lot of it is, the technological side is certainly over my head. So how do we really make that clear? So what's really interesting as well is, now this is the paper I wish I'd written. You know, when you're preparing for a talk and you Google and you see what there is, you do a search, and I found this paper. This is the paper it's really good, actually. So this colleague, he's in law, he's from Singapore, and he talks about these issues on the right. And then he talks about internal and external aspects of carebots. So he points out, rightly, of course, carebots lack human consciousness. They do not possess contentious rights. Some people claim they do have human emotions. And they lack understanding as to how it feels to care. And then the question to you, does that matter? How does it feel to care? Those of us who've worked here, we know how it feels to care. And sometimes, of course, it can be challenging. Also, they have the inability to feel pain and suffering or experience vulnerability. Is that an issue? Is that a concern for you? Because I would certainly argue that there's definitely advantages in feeling vulnerable and also experience and having life experience. So I think that's a really interesting point. And then there's the external aspect. Responses may be perceived as caring by human care recipients. So that's the demonstrative part. But, you know, I would say that, and I'd immediately say, but of course, some caregivers, human caregivers, they act as if, right? They perform. They do not always they're not always authentic, I would suggest. At least, yeah. So anyway, so you could think about that. So these frameworks are familiar to everyone here. Utilitarianism, as you know. So this author in Singapore, he takes us through the various approaches and frameworks. So familiar to all of you. So you can think about carebots from a purely pragmatic, utilitarian, you weigh the benefits and harms, the short term, the long term. And the question is, in relation to who? In relation to who? That's the thing. Because from a utilitarian point of view, carebots could be very advantageous. They may save money. You don't have the complexity of humans to deal with. So that's a critical question. It's in relation to who. Deontology, we know it's about our duties. And of course, we can look at our professional codes. What do they say? And we need to get with it. I mean, some organizations, I think the GEMC, probably AI guidance, many other professional bodies, regulators are a bit behind the curve, I would suggest, in really engaging with these issues. So our deontological frameworks are generally our codes that we guide. Virtue ethics has been alluded to, and they focus on moral qualities and dispositions. But this is the thing, there's a huge literature growing all the time on virtue ethics. And it goes back, of course, to Aristotle, to Confucius, and so on. But certainly in the professions, and just in January, I went to a conference, a couple of us here were there, it was the Birmingham Jubilee Centre for Character and Virtue. They have an annual conference. There was much discussion about leadership and virtues. There is no consensus as to which virtues. So I think that'd be an interesting conversation for us to have today. Care ethics, again, a growing literature, goes back to Carol Gilligan, Nell Noddings, and the most recent work, I guess, a lot by Virginia Held Joan Tronto and so on. And of course, the 4 principles, I think everyone in this room is probably familiar. Respect autonomy, do good, minimize harm, and treat people fairly. That's a very nice framework. And the question is, does that work? Is that enough in responding to the issues of carebots? This is another framework, and this was introduced again in that article. It's the global initiative around the ethics of autonomous and intelligent systems. And these are the principles. And I think this is really useful. This is almost a minimal threshold, but absolutely critical. First one is the technology needs to adhere to human rights. They ensure they do not infringe on internationally recognized human rights. We need to prioritize well-being. We need to prioritize the metrics of well-being in the design and use of these technologies. This is really important. I alluded to this right at the beginning. Accountability. Where does the buck stop? Where does the buck stop? Ensure that the designers and the operators are responsible and accountable. We need to be transparent, ensure they operate in a transparent manner, and we need to be aware of misuse and what follows from misuse in relation to this. I mean, we're still we're still quite preoccupied with how to minimize I guess, unethical practice in relation to humans, but this now would be another area that we would need to focus on. But accountability is particularly pressing there. So the ethics of care, as I do, some of you will know. If you don't know the work of Joan Tronto, I highly recommend. Very readable, very well known. And she has written a lot, of course. She's also a political philosopher, which is really important because, you know, there was a time when we focused on care in a professional, sort of individual area, but you need to be political as well. So she talks about these 4 phases of care: caring about, you need the attitude or the element of attentiveness; taking care of, we assume responsibility for another human; caregiving, we give care, we need to be competent; and the last one is care receiving. We also expect the care recipient, you know, where possible, to be responsive and sometimes even give gratitude, we might say. So I'm not going to answer all the questions for you, I'm afraid, but how does that relate to that? We can think about how it relates to humans. I think it doesn't require too much effort to do that. How does it relate to that carebot, these areas? It can be programmed to be attentive. Can it be programmed to be responsible? That would require it be a moral agent. Can a robot be a moral agent as we understand it? Need to be competent? Yes, I would say it could be competent to lift humans and do tasks, give medication and so on. And then, but this issue about responsiveness as well, because then we might get back to deception if a care recipient thinks the robot is human. So I don't want to take too much more time. This was I happened to look at this. Some of you will know this book, The Digital Doctor, 25th of really great, 2015. And I just came across McCall Smith, some of you know. So they wrote this, you know, I want to read it all out to you, but the point is that, you know, you can get that. But maybe you could say, well, could we program a care bot to be responsive to every eventuality? I don't know. I think I would just have to leave that with you. But it may be, and you know, this is again from asking people. People say, oh, well, of course, care bots, they'll be more patient, right? So, you know, caregivers often, they're tired, they work 12-hour shifts sometimes, they may not be as patient, but you could argue that a care bot could be relentlessly patient all of the time. Even if someone asks them for 10 times, is my husband visiting today? The care bot would not show any irritation, one could say, one could argue. You might say they're more rational. We humans, we're notoriously, well, if not irrational, we can be emotional, we can be less than fully rational, of course. A care bot could be more accepting. You might say they could be less biased, maybe, if they're programmed to be less biased, maybe less racist, like sexist, and so on. Maybe they'll be more sympathetic. I'm not going to use the word empathic because the next speaker is going to talk about empathy. So I'm not going to say anything about that. And the thing is, they'll be inexhaustible. A robot could work, you know, as long as they have the energy. And there's also an issue with where the energy comes from, because that's an environmental issue, of course. That's another ethical issue. But they're not going to get tired. They're not going to get jaded. And they're always going to look, you don't have the patient now, you poor thing, you look really exhausted. The robot should always look great, right? Depending on. So you can have a think about that. So nearly there. So humans. So the argument in the editorial, we said we need both. We need both. There's a place for care bots where we have to talk about all the nuance and the different kinds of care bots. And just in the UK, you know this, we have the NHS long-term plan, 15-year plan, huge challenges, very welcome, but one of the things we're having at the moment is a recruitment. I'm not going to use that word again. That's challenges, just saying challenge. We have huge recruitment challenges. And look at on the right, one of the, I would say, deterrents is our young people. Maybe this is just anecdotal. Our young people are seeing our healthcare professionals, out on the picket lines asking for more money. And there was all the clapping during COVID, and then there was an increase, and now the numbers have gone down again. So I do think political bodies of any brand need to acknowledge that our caregivers need to be respected and acknowledged. So that's a political issue. So near there. So can carebots care? Yes. I think in relation to the activities of care, the lifting, the medication, those things. But a caring attitude, this is back to Toronto, she talks about care as being sort of activity and attitude. I'd have to leave that open, and maybe just my imagination is limited, and an ethically programmed carebot is comparable with a caring human. I think I just have to leave that open. So I want to say, what do you think? What do you think? And I'm just going to finish with this. One of the virtues that has been alluded to already in terms of the values forum is prudence, practical wisdom. I mean, what I would absolutely say, as this evolves, health and social care professionals need to be in the conversation, and also patients, families, and communities. This should not be left to tech, absolutely not. So I think we need to work very hard in our various organizations. And of course, what you bring to the table is practical wisdom and lived experience. So I think that's absolutely critical. So we think about prudence as sort of the regulator virtue, what would I say, the rudder that guides everything else.